Welcome to another episode of Spotlight at Northern. My name is John Schaff. I'm professor of political science at Northern State University. As always, I'm joined by my colleague, Steve Usitalo, professor of history, Ken Blanchard, professor of political science emeritus. And here we are doing our last show of the year. It's been a while. Schedules have gotten crazy. Lots of stuff to talk about, politics and culture and elections and whatnot. We're going to start here. Tariffs, good or bad? I feel like I should be John McLaughlin now. Can the Beetle Blanchard?
I'm going to stumble uncontrollably into the truth.
To the truth, yes.
Yes, I do remember.
Your thoughts on, maybe I'll preface it this way. I don't know if you guys got anything. I did in the mail this week. A thing from one of our local car dealers.
Yes.
Encouraging me to go buy a car now before tariffs hit.
It's a pre-tariff blowout,
yes.
I think I got that too.
Which sounds like, I don't know, a heavy metal hit from 1984, pre-tariff blowout.
So they're not willing to accept the hit financially?
Apparently not. Well, but then I've been talking to a couple people who, shall we say, sell heavy machinery. Oh. And they're actually experiencing a little bit of a bump because people are trying to get ahead of the tariffs. So even locally, you see people are acting based on what they think is going to happen. It's unclear. Did I read something today? There's been an agreement with the UK on something?
The Trump administration has announced that they have agreed, but I don't think anything more than that.
Yeah, and I don't know the details. It's been a busy day. I've seen a headline, and that's it. But well, here, you talk about, what do you think of all this?
Tariffs as an instrument of protectionism, that is to say, raising taxes on goods, imported goods, in order to benefit your own industries, is generally a very bad thing economically. Now, there can be reasons for it. For example, I would really like the United States not to be dependent on China for parts for our warplanes. Bringing manufacturing back to the United States, there's a national interest case for that if tariffs, in fact, have that effect. It's unclear exactly what Trump is intending to do with this, but as we were just thinking about, there's rumor that a trade deal is about to be done with Britain. Also, there were two other parties. I think one of them, Israel. Is about to is agreed to some kind of trade deal, according to the administration. We haven't seen the details yet. I think India they're getting close to an agreement on India. As an instrument of trade negotiations, especially if you don't actually ever collect the tariffs, which at this point might actually happen. It might be that nobody's going to pay any of this in the long run. Well, it just depends on whether the negotiations work out. But it is amazing. One of the things I've noticed about Trump is he can transform his enemies into the opposite of what they think they are. Suddenly, every leftist in the country is in favor of free trade. That was an achievement.
I could say, though, that the obverse is true. One of the things I've seen just in talking to people is, what does it take to get a bunch of people on the left to argue in favor of free trade and to get a bunch of Republicans arguing in favor of massive tax increases? Yeah. It takes Donald Trump, apparently, and people are willing to do a 180-degree flip on their convictions based on orange man good or orange man bad. Stephen, what do you got?
Although I think the Democrats, whatever you make of the Democrats, ever since Clinton's in the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Democrats have largely abandoned protectionism. I mean, for decades, they have nobody. And the left consists of 12 people around the Nation magazine, so there's not much of a left. There's not much of a left in the U.S. anymore. But the thing about tariffs, I think it...
economic left, but go on.
Treating Trump fairly in this case is that it got a terrible rollout, as usual with many of his policies, where he got the math wrong, they couldn't figure out the percentages, they imposed arbitrary numbers on countries. So that was just sloppy. And then the second part is, as many people have pointed out, one of the reasons we're so prosperous is that we get our T-shirts and other products from Vietnam and other places. We get our phones from countries. Do we really want I don't know about you. I don't want my daughter working in a T-shirt factory in Illinois. I don't want anybody to work in a T-shirt factory in Illinois. Manufacturing jobs are 20th century early. We've moved beyond. We're a post-industrial economy. So I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I mean, for many people, it destroyed their livelihoods. It did for many people. But that ship has sailed. So if a goal of his administration is to create industrial jobs in the United States, it won't work. Those jobs will not come back.
I think that's almost certainly true.
Yeah. So I don't know what the goals are.
The one thing to note is that a lot of things that we think of, I mean, in fact, the iPhone is a good example that we think of as made in China. And it is in some sense, but it really is from parts made other places, right? They're not making those parts in China. You could do. In fact, doesn't Apple have a slogan that like, made all over the world, assembled in China?
Isn't Tesla the same? That it's made
I don't know.
I think Tesla's made all over the place,
So and I just think this notion of, for one thing, the more important reason why manufacturing left the United States is automation.
Yeah.
I heard a statistic this week that, and I can't remember the exact date, but something like 1955 or 1960, it took 10 man-hours to produce a ton of steel. And today, it's 1-to-1. It takes 1 man-hour to produce 1 ton of steel because it's automated. So even if like all the steel jobs came back to America, it wouldn't be all the steel jobs. It would be fewer steel jobs than there were in the 1950s and 60s. And so the argument this is going to bring jobs back, I don't think is not true. Even though I think there are, as you know, there are legitimate grievances. I've said, I think 10,000 times. I think one of the reasons for Donald Trump and the sort of the populist wave in the United States is when we reach the age of hyperglobalization, really with the fall of Soviet communism and European communism, and we reached an age of hyperglobalization in the 1990s. And I think that age has had, by and large, enormous benefits, right? The benefits to the world of this globalized age have been enormous, calculated in wealth, caloric intake, life expectancy, infant mortality, all these, clean water, education. You could just go down a list. So it's been this great boon, but there are losers. And the problem we've had politically in the United States is that our policy has tended to be made by, for, and of the winners of globalization with a kind of contempt for the losers of globalization. And so there's a reason why people are angry, which doesn't, I think, justify the tariff policy, which we'll see if it ever gets enacted. If it did, the consequences, I think, would be quite dire. It certainly would be negative.
Yeah, but I think that you've put your finger, you've lurched uncontrollably into the truth.
Yes.
In the sense that it's just not possible to use tariffs the way one once could when there were relatively small numbers of big manufacturing industries. When you could have, in the first century of the United States, manufacturing versus agriculture. It was as simple as that for a lot of purposes. And nowadays, almost anything that you do to help one part of your economy is going to hurt some other part. Yeah. That having been said, Hyundai just announced something like a $21 billion investment in the United States, which is apparently going to create an enormous number of jobs. And part of that is to make sure they don't have to worry about tariffs when they're selling Hyundai cars to Americans. So it's not like there's no effect or no use to these things. And again, I think jobs is one thing. Trying to create jobs with tariffs is probably a losing proposition. Worrying about manufacturing capacity for emergencies is another thing. And I'd like to think that Trump is intelligently doing that.
But one thing I'm worried about, like with sort of segueing into what John said too, is back in the 80s and 90s when the automobile industry declined, Toyota, Mercedes, they promised these jobs. They promised we're going to employ 100,000 people in Spring Hill, Tennessee, or whatever plants they were planning. Those jobs are now about 3,000 because of automation. Why would Hyundai come here and build a factory that is not going to make money for them because of the amount of people they have to employ at it? It'll be inefficient to a degree. One of those things that people look at when they looked at China is they look at some of these recent studies, and unfortunately, I think a lot of the trade people around Trump rely on somebody named Gordon Chang, who gets nearly everything wrong about China for the last 40 years, predicting the collapse of China for 40 years. But you go to China, these people who are not pro-Chinese, and they say it's littered with dark factories, automation. It's not a 1970s eat-all kind of an economy. In many ways, in batteries, in chip technology, in EVs, they're way ahead of the U.S. and arguably in AI as well now. So in that sense, they're not a developing economy; they're a developed economy. And so
I think that's definitely true.
And so we're misjudging some of these. So I do like the idea of Hyundai building a plant here. So is the Chinese National Semiconductors building a plant in Arizona. But they've already scaled down by 75% the amount of people they said they're going to work there.
Yeah, as
because
I
they
said,
make these promises to get tax benefits in these areas, and then once they get these tax benefits, they immediately drop down what they're going to do.
As an instrument for creating jobs, I think that this is not a very promising policy. As an instrument for creating wealth and manufacturing capacity, in that sense, it doesn't matter how many. More automation, the better, because you've got a more efficient factory, and it's in Tennessee or Arizona.
You're right. Yeah.
And there's some advantages in that. Yeah. So, and that's unfortunately, when we listen to NPR, we get half the story every time. Yeah. We never get is there any way that these tariffs might benefit the United States? You're never going to hear that on NPR.
Well, I would even challenge that. I just think the notion that somehow you're going to return a manufacturing capacity to the United States through tariffs, that even if that were true, I'm not sure it's worth the pain caused by doing so. And it grates on me, when Donald Trump says, why do you need $20? You can have $5. How many pencils do you need? Here's one thing I can say. I don't think the President of the United States has any business telling anybody how many dolls they need, right? Or how many pencils are enough. I will buy as many dolls as I want to buy. In my case, it will be approaching zero. But this notion that somehow the government should be deciding how much of these products is enough for each of you. And you can already see, even with your Hyundai example, you see this coming out of the woodworks, is the people now negotiating with the Trump administration to get exemptions. And can I get my cut of the deal? Can I get my cut of the deal? And now what you've got, instead of people just engaging in efficient economic activity, it just puts yet another reason for companies to engage in rent seeking. How can we give these people a deal? How can we give these people a deal? How can we subsidize this one while we're going to tariff that one? How about you just let the free market work? And we'll leave it at that. And that is the best way to create wealth for the most people. Instead of Trump trying to play industrial policy, which is, again, encouraging businesses to start engaging in politics instead of just run your business efficiently.
I agree with everything you say. I'm not sure.
And on to the next subject.
We have agreement on tariffs.
I'm not sure how well it applies to this. What will matter is when all this shakes out. Do we get freer trade? Do we get a lot of agreements? Because this is one of these things that a lot of people didn't know when this thing started, is the United States has some of the lowest tariff rates in the world. Almost all of our trading partners protect their industries to a greater degree than we do. If we get freer trade out of this in the end, which I think is still possible, I think it's almost likely, for reasons that we've mentioned, because, all attempts to really use tariffs, to really bring jobs back are going to fail. If that's what we get in the end, then we're in pretty good shape. As for 30, the argument, Trump's statement about dolls was politically deaf, was really stupid. On the other hand, presidents do have to think about the impact of their policies, and if the impact of their policies is dolls get more expensive, they got to weigh that against something else. So it doesn't seem to me to be an inappropriate thing to think about. Next topic.
I'll give this to Trump on this subject. he has admitted that, at least in the short run, tariffs will cause pain. I think it's also medium and long, but he's admitted at least that much, which makes him unusual for a politician, that he is sort of telling the truth about there are pluses and minuses to my policy. Here are some of the minuses.
Although
he's not trying
he's
to...
He's talked about dolls, but he hasn't talked about food, which is a thing that we can live without dolls, but let's see when food prices start to rise, how much we can live without. Yeah.
Okay. This is true. What's something you want to talk about, Ken, is disinformation. You know, we are learning some things, I think, about COVID and COVID policy and what we knew and when did we know it and what did the government tell us and how much of it was true. Well, how about you introduce the subject, because I think it's been on your mind.
Yeah.
You tell us what's on your mind about it.
Well, I mean, I think the biggest scandals in the last 20 years are finally getting a little bit of attention. And we're getting books out, many of them by people who are involved in the scandals, and are now saying, "Oh, I knew it all along." Jake Tapper's book on the president's mental capacity. There's no question that the White House engaged in a year-long, if not more, conspiracy to conceal the president's mental capacity from the American people. I don't think anybody doubts that anymore, and that the press was, at the very least, acquiescent in this. They did not investigate it. They didn't go after it, and to some degree, I think clearly were complicit in trying to keep it a secret. This is the guy who has his finger on the nuclear weapons. Now, I mean, it's an existentially bad scandal, and almost nobody's treating it as such. What brought this to mind especially was last week I was driving somewhere and I turned on NPR, which I tend to listen to when I'm driving. You always know you're on the right station when you hear, "Trump today did this terrible thing." You know you're listening to NPR, but this was unusual. It was a interview with David Zweig, who's written this book about the school shutdowns during COVID. And Meghna Chakrabarti, anyway, was the interviewee, and it was astounding for something on NPR, because they admitted the obvious thing, that the truth about the school shutdowns was intentionally concealed by health officials, by scientists, and with the complicity, again, and to some degree cooperation of the American press. We knew very quickly that school shutdowns were not doing any good, because the Europeans fairly quickly started to reopen their schools, and there were no adverse effects. And if anything, infection rates in a lot of these places went down. Now, that might have been just an accident, but certainly there was no good reason to keep schools closed. The United States many states kept them open for almost a year. In some places for a year, and I think a few places a little bit more than that. We knew that this is a bad thing, and there are probably millions, certainly hundreds of thousands of students in this country who are never going to catch up because of that year out of school. And why then did we not? And one of the things that this book is about, to judge by the interview, was that the information was there. The Europeans, if you looked at the European press, you knew exactly what was going on, that they were opening schools, it was fine. If you look at the American press, it was completely ignored. Now that's a scandal all on its own. But the most astounding thing about the interview was that Chakrabarti basically acknowledged that one of the main reasons why the press why they circled their wagons to protect the shutdown policy was because Donald Trump came out and said, we should open schools. And at that point, it became the third rail among science. The author of the book, Zweig, talks to a lot of people who are, in various technological positions with regard to healthcare. And he said, none of us would come out and say we should reopen the schools, because it was a career killer. We would have been ostracized. We would have been called fascist, that sort of thing. Those are the wages of Trump derangement syndrome. And I think mostly that was acknowledged in the interview. Now, I would also add something that's kind of interesting, that when I went to look for a transcript to send you guys, I went to the NPR website and you can't find it. I finally found one at a local NPR station somewhere where they had the transcript, and so I could print it off and read it and go through it. This is big news. We can't trust the American press. We can't trust the American medical establishment. These folks lied to us about something really important. This strikes me as...
I got to jump in on this just for one
Sure.
thing. And the thing that I think there's some aspects of it, I think there was an overreaction. I remember when it had started in March in the news, which was global at that point. I remember when Boris Johnson was hauled to the hospital in London, they said he was going to die. And people were terrified. I was afraid for my daughter and others. Other people were afraid. Yes, it was exaggerated over the short term, but then it's state by state, because in Minnesota, my daughter stayed home for but nobody here stayed home. So it wasn't a national policy in the U.S. It was a state-by-state policy.
I think that's true.
More than half the Americans' kids stayed home. I mean, went to school. Only small pockets of largely blue states,
well, you're talking about how long you're talking about.
well, here they only
And
stayed
also
for 6
those
weeks.
small pockets, but what do you mean by a small pocket?
California.
It's like Chicago.
Yeah, but I'm saying no.
Right,
I'm,
that's
it's-
hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, but
of
I'm saying
kids.
that was a true states' rights policy.
For
That's a
several
states'
months, you're right. I mean, this was not a national policy pushed from above in that sense. It was based on advice pushed by national institutions.
But Trump. But here's the thing: is I agree with the exact. But Trump was the one who had himself vaccinated multiple times, including 3 weeks ago for the last COVID thing. He was the one who put Fauci in charge of the whole policy.
Oh, yeah.
He's the one who urged the federal shutdown in March. So I think part of the problem was that it's sure they weaponize it. Democrats weaponize it. I have no question. There's no question about it. But he gave them the weapons with the inconsistent policies on COVID, because initially he supported it, the shutdown.
Oh, yeah. I mean,
You know?
if Trump had stuck to his guns and we had, instead of the policy we had for a year of almost nobody going outside, we had something like the Swedish model, which we now know was the right way to do it. Sweden basically didn't shut down.
No.
People still went to restaurants. They observed reasonable precautions. And over that period of time, their excess death rate, just one of these funny concepts where you try and figure out about how many people on average are going to die given a population, given all this sort of stuff. Sweden's average death rate was the lowest over that period of time of any of the European countries, with the least severe shut. And there was no reason to believe in shutdowns in the first place. All you had to do was think about it for 5. There was no scientific evidence behind the idea that at first they said, well, we're gonna slow the spread so we can adjust. But the story kept changing in order to keep the shutdowns, to keep that pressure going.
There's really two things. We're arguing about COVID policy and media at the same time, which are related but separable. When it comes to COVID, I think what we have to remember is that, I think in those first, let's say, 2 months, I can forgive almost anybody for almost anything they proposed, because precisely nobody knew what was going on. When you heard about this is going to be this much more deadly than a flu, and then you did the math, like, wow, that's a lot of people. Okay, maybe, remember, what was it? What was it? The 2 weeks to stop the
3 weeks. 3 weeks to stop
the spread, or whatever the heck it was, right? And that sort of dragged on and dragged on. I would say, in fact, I remember walking here in Aberdeen sometime like in April, and they had put police tape over the playground equipment.
Oh yeah.
And thinking, what country do I live in? And in retrospect, how stupid that was, because those kids should have been outside playing on that equipment. I mean, it was entirely, but at the time, we didn't quite know that. But I think by the summer of 2020, one thing I think we knew by then is that in a quasi-miracle, we had an epidemic that was not affecting kids. That in most epidemics, kids and the elderly are hurt worse. This was the opposite. Kids did much better. The
only thing unusual about COVID compared to, say, your annual flu season, and it was worse than your annual flu season, but the reason was because it was uniquely lethal to people who were, in their 70s or 80s, or had 4 or more comorbidities. Those folks were in unique trouble. Virtually everybody else, it was just. And
a lot of it was driven in terms of education in universities by teachers and faculty who felt like, I can see my wife, who's in with 5 to 8-year-olds, has gotten 6, 7, or 8 times this past year, which is pretty typical for elementary school. So it wasn't so much that they thought the kids, although some did, they exaggerated. You're 100% right, but I think a lot of it was driven maybe for the excesses of some teachers unions who wanted to close everything down.
So I guess the question is, why other than we go back to Orange Man Bad, other than if Trump says sky is blue, we have to say the opposite. Why do you think the media operated as a cover? And we all know, like, the saying this was a lab leak from Wuhan was enough to get you banished in some circumstances. I recently heard an interview with our now NIH director, Jay Bhattacharya, and the hell he went through at Stanford, where like he was ostracized, and his colleagues, his friends, stopped talking to him because he advocated essentially the Swedish model in the United States, and was worried, am I going to keep my job? What about my funding? And it was awful.
The authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, who were targeted for career destruction. I'm not really
with
sure.
With government complicity, actually, in that case.
With
government complicity. Because we've got the emails from Fauci and Francis Collins saying, shut these people up.
I'm not sure that you necessarily need more than Orange Man Bad, because it was so pervasive in the culture, as it remains today, that everybody's, it's like, I was asked once, why the name of Marx is so important to Marxist. Well, the answer is it's a badge of loyalty. If you say you're not a Marxist, then you're beyond the pale, right? If you said during that period of time that we really shouldn't keep the schools closed, that we really have gone overboard, you were immediately identified as a right-winger. And that was pervasive through the press. It was pervasive through the universities and the government bureaucracies to some degree. And part of that was, I think a lot of the skeptics, myself, were on the right, politically conservative, and so that, I think, is the primary reason that the press did such a bad job. Now, there are other things. For one thing, it's not hard to figure out why bureaucrats love this. It was a wet dream for them. You get to tell people what to wear. You get to boss people around in ways that they never could before, with no legislation. Suddenly, governors all over the place are claiming wonderful new powers.
But do you think possible, like when you talk about the medical profession, it's not so much, I think, that there was a conspiracy. It's just that the American medical profession, by and large, over-prescribes and over-regulates every aspect. Let me give you an example. When I went just to a dentist recently in Minneapolis, and he tells me, I'm talking about afterward, and he tells me, so here's what you need to do on a daily basis to keep your teeth healthy. You get up, you floss, you brush your teeth. Midday, you floss, you brush your teeth. Evening, you floss, you brush your teeth. You use mouthwash twice a day, and you get a water pick to use in between. This is so 9 times a day. But the medical profession does the same thing. I think they generally, it was a chance for them to basically argue that you have to stay home, you have to be vaccinated, you have to take every medical precaution. That's why when I go in and my thumb is sore, they're going to give me an MRI, not realizing that I just fell on my thumb, right? They're going to insist. It's just part of the way the medical profession is. They push these types of things. But I'm not sure it's a conspiracy. It's more just a mindset, a hive mindset.
I'm not arguing that it's conspiracy in the sense that St. Anthony of Fauci got together with his
It's just the way
conspirators in a castle somewhere and planned this whole thing. Of course not. What it was a mindset that was lockstep and pervasive across these institutions. And what matters, whatever it may have been, is that we got bad advice. We got really bad policy.
Well, and to your media point, you started with the Biden example. And one of the things that I think is central to the problems we have with media is what I guess we can call the establishment media, which has a definitive bias, which I think is empirically unimpeachable that there is a bias. There is so much evidence that there is a bias in the establishment media to the left, and the way that manifests itself is credulity. Basic Psych 101, right? I mean, there's a line that Jonathan Haidt has in his Righteous Mind book that when you hear things that confirm your priors, if you will, you ask, how can I believe this? And then when you hear something that challenges your prior conceptions, it's, should I believe this? Right?
Or how can I figure out?
How can I reject this versus I'm going to think of any single way that I can to believe this versus I'm going to think of anything I can to reject this. And I think a lot of people I'd say probably the preponderance in the media, the idea of combating government control, right? If Fauci is the voice of government control.
I am science.
Right? And people literally are buying their candles, right? Light your Anthony Fauci candle. Whatever they say must be true.
I'd like to have one of those.
Yes. I mean, burning at both ends. But, same with the Biden story. I saw a thing recently, Jen Psaki, who's now working for MSNBC, the former press secretary for Joe Biden, his first press secretary, and saying, I didn't see any signs of decline. Well, either A, she's lying, which I think is the best interpretation.
Yes. Or
you have someone who so lacks basic observational skills and has a toddler-like experience with older people. I don't know how, in fact, she said, I'm not a scientist. Do you really need to have a medical degree to say, boy, that old guy isn't what he used to be? Right? I don't think it's akin with our Supreme Court Justice Kendra Jackson Brown saying she doesn't know what a woman is because she's not a doctor. I'm not sure you need an MD.
But part of it is this political. It's a nice segue. Take a look at the New York Magazine article, which came out this week on John Fetterman.
Yeah.
Which is by a Democrat who wrote this article.
Yeah.
Fetterman, if this article is true, should be in a mental hospital. Mm-hmm. He is completely incapable of daily activities.
Yes.
But he was running against Oz, right? So you had to vote for him. You had to say that he was fine. He was smart. He was.
I think we're talking about two very different.
No, for Biden though, here's the thing about Biden is that I agree. They're lying. This book, the Tapper book, but there's also a book called. It's the one who wrote on Clinton too. These two reporters. I don't remember their names. I think it's called Fight.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
And I've seen read segments of the book where it's true that Biden did not know who he was talking to. Probably in 2021.
People that he'd known for decades, he didn't know who was right in front of him.
Leading the way. But if you're in this belief that it's either for self-interest, and I think for Jill Biden, Hunter Biden, that group, it was self-interest. Mm-hmm. How else do you stay in power? For other people, it was there's an existential crisis, and that's Trump. And for some reason, they thought in their own mindset, Kamala Harris, and they were probably right, she couldn't win. So, and they thought Biden, actually, in my belief, Biden would have probably done better than Harris if he had run in the end. But I'm not positive. But the thing is, they were convinced that Biden was the only one who can win. I'm not sure why they believed that, but they believed it.
Well, they had future. Look, these are two very different cases in this sense. That I think that you could say of the COVID thing, of the misinformation about COVID, bad policies about COVID, that the people pushing these policies really believed to some degree. Now, Fauci may be an exception. He bragged on record about lying to the American people in order to manipulate their behavior.
Yeah.
The numbers, I would say, were not based on real fact. They were based on what I thought would produce the best outcomes. Now, but for the most part, I think that really was a mindset thing. That, it was an automatic reaction. Trump's in favor of it, therefore we ought to be against it. The concealment of Biden's mental decline, that was deliberate. It was carefully orchestrated. They divided the White House staff into two groups. Those they thought they could trust never to say anything. And the others who were not allowed to see Biden. I mean, they would whisk him out whenever he came into the rooms. And this, I think, was throughout the whole, at least a year of that. That was a conspiracy.
Well, it was probably in 2020 because he was lucky that he didn't have to run a campaign in 2020, right? He's basically stayed.
He might not have. Well, I suspect without COVID.
As somebody has pointed out, even if you're cognitively in decline, you can pull your shit together for one speech, which he did for the one State of the Union, which saved him apparently.
He did it multiple. Actually, he did it multiple times. I don't know what they were
But
shooting him up with, but he had the ability, up until probably the last year, that when he needed to, he could sort of like get his crap together. I'll clean it up for the kids. Get his crap together
for
like an hour. Yeah. Like for an hour, he could.
Then he went on vacation afterward. I get it.
He could get it. He could get it together, right? But I still think that in all of this, I think you've got a press that is completely. The law professor Glenn Reynolds always used to had this little quip that there was a moral imperative for there to be a Republican president because it's the only way to get the media to do their jobs. Now, he's somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but there's something to it, which is that is not the best reason to vote for president. Let me just put it that way. But take it for a slightly comedic quip. What the import behind it is. When he always said that when Obama was in office, and then in Biden is they just don't ask the questions, right? And when Tim Grosclose did his study of media bias many years ago, he said the way media bias evinces itself. This is a political scientist and economist who's now at George Mason. He said the way media bias evinces itself is, he said, it's not what is said, it's what is not said, right? It's the questions that aren't asked. Right? The things that you just accept without question. And that's how bias manifests.
The Axios story that was the first to really blow the lid on Biden and the conspiracy to protect him was published days after that disastrous debate with Trump. They knew it was right there. They had it in the can, and I suspect that a lot of other folks out there. But there's no way NPR was going to break a story that might have cost the Democrats the presidential election.
Yeah. But
if it had come to that, and they had actually had to decide, press the button, send the story or not, and they thought this might cost the Democrats the election, they would have pulled their hand back.
Mm-hmm. But I met a lot of people. I met a lot of people after the fact who've said the same. They said even if they knew Biden, they still would have. The hatred for Trump was so strong.
Sure.
And after that first debate, I remember listening to the CNN panel. I think it was about 15 people there, Axelrod, everybody else. And yeah, it was inappropriate for people like, is Vin Jones one of the people I'm thinking about?
Van Jones.
And where he starts by saying, I have to start by saying that I love Joe Biden. Well, I don't want the reporter to tell me. And Joe Scarborough starts every statement the same way. I love Joe Biden. It's hard for me. It's like an elderly parent it's very hard to face. No, it's not. I don't want to hear that he loves the person he's covering as a news item, right? It's inappropriate. But you're right.
Even if they're lovable. I can remember one of the
and Biden wasn't really that lovable, but still.
The McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, there's a young woman, a reporter, I can't remember her name now, but when she got to interview Nelson Mandela, it was embarrassing. Because, he was a world historic figure, and I understand why. But she treated him like he was a god, like he had walked off a Renaissance painting. And you want them to be more skeptical. We probably should find another.
Move on.
Great topic, though.
I was gonna the other maybe slightly related to this. One of the things I want to talk about is the Trump administration has been making some moves against universities. At this point, mostly Ivy League universities, specifically Harvard and Columbia, largely, though not exclusively, over anti-Semitism and their failure to address anti-Semitism on their campuses. And there was another slew of university presidents in front of Congress yesterday. Oh. And the countdown before the president of Haverford in Pennsylvania loses her job should start right about now, as she embarrassed herself in front of that committee in her unwillingness to say, we punish people who threaten genocide against our Jewish students. And she could not bring herself, she did everything she could to duck that question. And go on YouTube and find that. It is...
Wow.
It's almost like watching an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, like one of these comedic episodes where it's funny, but you're cringing because it's so embarrassing. Like, I feel embarrassed for this person, but she should be the one who's embarrassed. But they also, like, especially with Harvard, the Trump administration sent this letter, perhaps a mistake. Now it turns out they sent the wrong letter.
Did you see how badly it was written?
Yes. There are now reports that that was actually a draft.
Yeah, I've heard that same thing.
And it was accidentally sent to them.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, probably that. Yeah.
Yes. But this is one where, like, they want to start monitoring classes and they want curricular reviews, and which is really heavy-handed. But then there are threats that they're going to strip all public funding from Harvard, which is billions of dollars that Harvard gets in grants every year from the federal government, and Columbia maybe threatening their tax-exempt status. And there's some uneasiness, I think, in higher. I don't think Northern has much to worry about in these remarks. We're so small. I don't think anybody notices we are the gnat on the rear end of the higher education elephant. There's some worries about we have speech and the freedom of universities to act, consistent with academic freedom. And do we have any thoughts on state of the universities vis-a-vis the Trump administration? Are they a threat to the university into free inquiry?
President of University of Michigan resigned the other day too. So
oh, really?
He took a job at the University of Florida, which would be like going from Harvard to Northern in many ways. So
is he going to be president of Florida?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's a step down.
He was pushed out though because of. He didn't really get pushed out. His house had been defaced, and he'd been under attack. This faculty union, like most faculty unions, are going to be overwhelmingly anti-administration, pro-Gaza, pro-issue of genocide. So he's constantly facing no confidence votes, and so it's just impossible to govern when you're in that.
There is an issue. I think maybe the analogy that occurred to me the other day was South Dakota v. Dole. And the Supreme Court concluded that, South Dakota can have whatever drinking age it wants, but if they want federal funds, the Congress can decide who to give it to. Well, if states have a constitutional right to regulate alcohol that's unique and protected, using federal funds to make the state do what you want does strike me as constitutionally problematic. So there is an issue with a place like Harvard. But the question is, does Harvard have any constitutional right to these kinds of funding? Harvard can say whatever it wants. Does it? And the Congress or the president, in this case, maybe can decide whether to fund it or not. The most interesting thing about the Harvard story is that the Harvard report that came out, and it's another one of these surprising examples of admitting that there has been pervasive anti-Semitism at Harvard. And I think there's all kinds of evidence for that. But the report was scathing about Harvard's conduct. And my favorite line was something like, well, we have Jewish students, and yes, they're under a lot of pressure, and yes, they're constantly being subjected to unfair treatment, but they're thriving. Well, that's good to know that you can thrive under all that. It's bad.
The Supreme Court case that everybody's studying now is Bob Jones versus the United States, or is it U.S. versus Bob Jones? I don't remember which one it is. One of those directions. Case also from the 80s, though I think earlier in the 80s than U.S. v. Dole, where Bob Jones University, an evangelical university in South Carolina, which had a policy against interracial dating. And so the question was, could Bob Jones maintain its tax-exempt status while having this explicitly racist policy? Well, they would say racialist. I'll leave it. Look it up. You judge. But certainly segregationist policy. And the Supreme Court said, you lose, Bob Jones. This is against public policy. You do not have the right to tax-exempt status. And so if Harvard is institutionally, systematically discriminating against its Jewish students, and that there is institutional complicity in denying civil rights to Jewish students to an education, as well as there is evidence that they are in violation of the Supreme Court, that they are still discriminating against Asian students in admissions, that the admissions policy is still racially discriminatory at Harvard, they could be stripped of their federal funds and they could be stripped of their tax-exempt status because they are engaging in institutional racial discrimination in violation of Title VI of the 64 Civil Rights Act. And they would find themselves in big trouble. I'll also note, by the way, in something that, I have my own conflicted opinions about Donald Trump, but something that made my heart sing is he's going after the accrediting agencies in higher education. Oh, in this case it is, because one of the reasons you get a lot of this racial politics on the kind of racial policies on campuses that end up getting campuses these days in trouble with civil rights law is the accrediting agencies are saying you have to have these things. And so universities are stuck between at least a Trump-led executive branch that says no racial discrimination and accrediting bodies that say you have got to engage in racial discrimination for purposes of diversity and multiculturalism and
part
whatnot.
of it is sort of this mind, like we had an external examiner, I was just reading his report on criminal justice, and he said his recent slate. And he came here last week, and I read his critique today or yesterday, and it said the purpose of the CJ program at Northern State University is to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Which the provost told me to remove from the report, which I did, which is fair enough, because it really isn't the mission. So he got it wrong. But part of it is just language that, I do think, there's something about elite universities, top 50, top 60 universities, where certain departments, comp lit, literature departments, everything that Edward Said sort of, there is a hatred of Israel that goes from, because the Soviets tried to be anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. Well, they failed. It's hard to it's hard to be both, right? You have to define. It's hard to define, but they tried. They tried, and
As Sharansky.
And they'll argue the same point. But the University of Minnesota appointed director of their Holocaust and Genocide Center last fall, Raz Segal, who was leading genocide scholar. And he wrote though a week after October 7th that Israel's actions were already genocide. A week after, and the president of the University of Minnesota stepped in and stopped the search. Right. So there is something about, but I'm not sure the way to do it is to cut funding, because the people who are going to be hurt are the science and other research, which have nothing to do with the political side.
Yeah, but if it has the effect that the university gets their act together and then the money comes back, the outcome might be good. I would add to what you just said. It's not just anti-Semitism. There's very little doubt that Harvard has been continuing to discriminate against Asian students.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Something it's been doing for a long time. Now that was Supreme Court rule on it. They finally decided, that racial discrimination is unconstitutional, even if you get the swatches right. Right? Even if you get the right colors and discriminate against the right people, it's still unconstitutional. And there's never been, I think, any reasonable doubt that Harvard and these other major universities have been running de facto quota systems. In fact, I think, as I read Bakke, the same way Justice Brennan did, ironically enough. But what Bakke basically said back in the 1970s was you can discriminate against white people just because they're white. You just can't admit it. You have to hide it. You have to pretend. You have to lie about it.
The Hennepin County attorney last week made a statement. I can't remember her name. She's much hated. but she made a statement where
she's in trouble now with the federal government.
About that racial politics. Didn't
Yes.
she say something that in arrest you can take into account the person's race in the rest?
Yeah, and that's why she's in trouble with the United States Justice Department. Is that when the district attorney or whatever they call it in Minnesota, in Hennepin County, says we're going to take race into account when we decide who we're going to prosecute and not prosecute, arrest, not arrest. Well, you just announced on TV that you're going to violate civil rights law.
Exactly.
And so that's going to be
It's hard to get people's
problem.
mindset around past that because there's a whole generation who came of age where,
Well, and who were trained in universities where they never talked to anybody who didn't agree with that.
Yeah, exactly.
That we should let people. So you murdered somebody. You're the right color. You get to go free.
There's a couple of Russianists, believe it, but there's a Russianist, I know her name is Marcy Short, but his name is Tim Snyder. Tim Snyder made a lot of news.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway,
I read his book.
They moved to Canada recently.
Oh, really?
In January. Loudly announcing that they left Yale, which seems to be a bastion of intolerance because of their anti-Trump views were not properly appreciated at Yale. And so they moved to Canada. But there is that mindset, because if you listen to a lot of this stuff, it is, I would be more accepting of their anti-Trump 2, but they were also anti-Trump 1. It was a little harder to be so violent.
I read Timothy Snyder's most recent book. It's got freedom in the title, and I can't remember what it's called. In fact, I reviewed it for a website. It is one of the worst books I've ever read. Yeah. It is. Here's a guy who, from what I understand, because this is your field, is a great scholar of Eastern Europe.
He's much. Well, there's a little jealousy because he makes a lot of money, because people don't like that in the book. Yep. But his stuff, you can't write as much as he can, based only on secondary sources. Well, like, for example, the Freedom book came out in his Facebook posts. Yep. He put them all together. And it
reads like frankly, it's pure garbage.
So, but it sells like,
So this guy might be a genius, and he's in his field. He's a scholar. This is one of the worst written books because it reads like a guy sitting in his underwear in his basement yelling about Trump on his computer. Yeah. I'm supposed to take this guy seriously.
And he also was discussing in Canada, he gave a speech, the Canadians are so distorted on this, where he was talking about the average American voter. This is a guy who spent 25 years at Yale, right? So I'm not sure how, and he's not a specialist on U.S. elections or U.S. history in any sense. So, but nonetheless, there we go.
That's one of the things I said in my review, that this is a book that was written precisely for cocktail parties of Yale faculty members. That's the crowd that is going to appeal to. You cited Canada. Do you want to say something about
the Canadian elections?
Your Canadian election?
The Canadian elections. That's quite. The Conservatives were probably ahead. It wasn't just that Justin Trudeau was personally unpopular. He had been there for 10 years, and it's time. And traditionally, Canadians, after 2 or 3 terms, they throw them out. They get a new one. This cycle's been going on. But he was 25, 26 points behind the Conservatives. The Conservative leader, though, the difficulty with Pierre Poilievre was that he wasn't personally that popular. Mm-hmm. The party was. So what happened was that he, for whatever reason, he got behind. He couldn't figure out how to approach the Trump issue in the Canadian election. The Liberals elected a technocrat who somehow wrapped himself up as sort of Canadian nationalist, anti-Trump, and the vote swung in the other direction, although not as much as they hoped. So the Conservatives increased their total from the last time. They got more votes now than they've had in decades. Liberals did a little bit better, but the way that first post the system works in Canada is that even if you're just a few percentage points ahead, you got the majority, right? Although they don't have a majority, they're close to a majority.
I knew that things were shifting in Canada when I was watching. There was a hockey tournament. Yeah. It has 4 in it, and I can't think of what they called it. It was Canada, United States, Sweden, and someone else. Because they don't let the Russians play in it because of the unpleasantness in Ukraine. It was another European country. Now I can't. The Finns. In fact, it was the Finns. That's who it was. It was so many Usitalo connections there.
They couldn't beat up the Russians though.
So it was the Finns. And the first game, it was in Montreal between U.S. and Canada, and the Canadians booed the United States national anthem.
Unheard of,
and vociferously. That's when I went, oh, things are changing. This cocksureness that Poilievre is going to be PM and it's going to be this wipeout. Maybe not, because
Although
that's the first indication. Maybe Canadian
Canada has a
opinion is
lot of
changing.
problems, though. They have a housing crisis, a price crisis. They have an immigration issue that's much more severe than the U.S. So he's going to have to face a deficit that's exploding out of control.
He doesn't have to have another election in for 5 years.
When they did, they listed the issues that Canadian voters cared about. Number one was Trump. Making Canada a better place to live was like number 6.
Yeah.
Now, there's something telling about that. No, Trump, God bless him, whether you like him or don't like him, he can shoot himself in the foot very easily. And this was a case where I think more than anything else, I don't think Poilievre could have done anything that would have changed the dynamic of this very much. And
because he was sort of cast as a little chump. By,
which is I think he's much more intelligent in a conventional way than Trump.
But he couldn't escape that label.
No, well, I don't think, I think he had very little to do with it. It was Trump. They were voting against Trump for insulting Canada, which is just really stupid. Yeah. And Trump, I think the Trump people kind of realized
they pulled back
a few months that they had to be really careful about it, but it was too late. It was way too late. So that's but
that 51st state rhetoric.
All that's
really
faded,
dumb.
by the way. The Greenland, where's the Greenland
really
issue over
I
the
don't
last
know.
3
Yeah, so you can afford to piss off
40,000 Greenlanders.
Yeah, I mean, in the Greenland.
We don't trade with Greenland, all right, but we do with Canada.
And we.
How about the Russia before we leave? That was I'm always interested in people's views
but
on
then
that,
you get all these stupid things about how Canada's going to decouple and end its alliance with the United States. Canada can't end its alliance with the United States.
By the way, my daughter's friends in Canada will say this about the Canadian. Some of them will remember who Don Cherry was. If you remember Hockey Night.
Yeah, Hockey Night USA,
but
or not USA, Hockey Night Canada.
They'll say that in Starbucks while using Google, with their Apple computers, with going to McDonald's that evening. And I'm saying it's impossible. Nobody's decoupling Canada from the United States.
And geographically, the United States could not allow a foreign power to invade Canada. No. The Canadians know this.
Canadian prosperity has always been based on U.S. prosperity.
I'm sure I've told you my one Canada joke. If not, I'm going to tell it to you again if I have told you. What's the difference between Canada and yogurt? Yogurt has a culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also a little bit of a science joke.
But what do you get?
Sorry, Canada. It's just a joke.
And more than 1 million Canadians live in the United States.
What do you get when you
huge numbers? Numbers.
What do you get when you cross a Canadian with a groundhog? 6 more weeks of hockey. Yeah, we can go on.
By the way, Wayne Gretzky has been vilified in Canada too. By the way,
why is that?
He's pro-Trump.
John.
I didn't realize that.
So suddenly it's like, forget him. He's not Canadian. He's
I want to throw something in here. John and I have been to Canada on professional meetings together a couple of times.
Vancouver, it's Canada-like.
But I mean,
it's more Chinese than
my wife.
It is.
Vancouver's very Asian. Went to Montreal, I guess, several years ago for a conference. Canada's a wonderful place.
Yeah. Well, beautiful.
It's a
beautiful country.
Beautiful country, and the people are really nice. And
it's hard to get them angry.
We've had the best cigars, and they were expensive golly. But boy, do we get good cigars in Vancouver.
But it also tells you something else about Canada, that in Vancouver you can't smoke in a public park outdoors. This is fascism, by God. But apart from that, no, the best thing about Canada, my favorite thing about Canada, is sitting down at a restaurant and watching the waiter walk up and try to figure out whether to say hello or bonjour.
Do both. That's what you're supposed to do. Did you want to say anything about Russia?
No, I want to ask
you. There's not much going on.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
As we sort of have a stasis in negotiations. It seems.
I mean, who was Trump's advisor who went to Moscow?
Was it Witkoff?
Yeah, but nothing's really happened, right? I mean, Trump met with Zelensky at the Pope's funeral, which somehow has been spun as a really positive meeting, but we don't know what. Maybe it was just a meeting face to face.
In fact, they didn't yell at each other as a step forward.
But I do think it's interesting. So some of the stuff that I've heard is Zelensky, I think, was badly treated in that public. But on the other hand, Zelensky should have probably realized what the setting was that he was at, and just kept his mouth shut. But he was not capable of doing it.
We're talking about the famous meeting between Zelensky and Trump, and I think the Democrats.
J.D. Vance, who I think was the real impetus behind that.
Yeah, but
provocateur.
I think the best explanation is simply the Democrats, before he went into that meeting, took him aside and said, "Don't let Trump push you around." They gave him bad advice.
Yeah, they did.
And being out of a fish out of water, or at least in the wrong ocean.
He doesn't speak English well.
No, he doesn't. He couldn't articulate what he was saying.
It was a difficult situation.
Carney, on the other hand, kept his mouth shut the other day.
Wise.
Yeah, wise.
The new PM.
On a closely related topic, Trump seems to have come to some agreement with the Houthis to stop shooting at international shipping.
Yeah.
That
I will believe that when I see it.
Okay, yeah.
For one thing, making a deal with the Houthis is like, I don't know.
How do you do it?
I'm trying to think of an example. Making a deal with Eddie Haskell. I mean, it's just.
Yeah, but
if the Houthis pinky swear they're not going to pirate ships anymore, I don't care. I'd rather just blow them out of existence. I don't trust. It's not worth the paper it's written.
That would probably require invading Yemen. I mean, maybe we should.
Well, the Israelis blew up the airport the other day.
Maybe we should do it. I'm not saying that you'd have to go that far, but if it's true that we got some kind of that in itself would be impressive, and if we get it. If Trump is right and there really is some kind of deal in the working, it's because the Houthis are afraid.
Yeah, no doubt.
He has made them afraid, and that kind of thing can keep very dishonest people honest.
Real quick, because we're a little bit, we like to do our little movie suggestion at the end of the show. So,
can you go first? Let me think here a second.
Sure. I'm the horror movie buff in this. Well, maybe we all are, but I'm the champion. I watched a movie, Argentine, I think, the other day, called Terrified. It was a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, and lots of weird stuff starts to happen, paranormal type stuff, and some investigators show up. And it's really hard to describe more than that without giving much away, except that the guys who play the people who play the investigators are remarkably good actors. And there is a scene in that movie, it's not gory. I will only say that it involves a dead body being where it's not supposed to be. Mm-hmm. And it is one of the most striking images I have ever seen in a film of any kind. Terrified.
Terrified.
I think it was 2020, somewhere in that maybe around in there. Mm-hmm. But this scene, when you pan around into a dining room, and then, well, it's not gory. It's just, it was, every time I closed my eyes, I could see this thing. It was amazing. Okay, that's mine.
You want to go? Because I'm ready.
Okay, I'll say.
You go.
Let me give you a segue to it. For my genocide class, I showed a film to them that was some non-AI generated responses, which I thought was really. It's called The Act of Killing. Act of Killing is an American director named Joshua Oppenheimer, who he came out about 7-8 years ago. In 1965, when Sukarno was ousted and Suharto was put in power, about 1 million people were murdered during the changeover. And what he did was he interviewed probably about 25 of the people who had taken power, and many of them still in power, mm-hmm. and they reenacted the killings that they took part in, based on Hollywood musicals and westerns and so forth. So you had Anwar Congo, for example, who was head of a death squad, killed 4,000 to 5,000 children and other people, recreating the way he killed the people in 1965, and at the end of this long 5 hours, 2 hours first for the perpetrators, and then he made another film on the victims. Anwar Congo finally, maybe one of the perpetrators, comes to the idea at the end that maybe what he did was excessive. And by the way, after that, I watched a good American movie on it. I'm not a big Mel Gibson fan, but it's called The Year of Living Dangerously.
Oh, back in like 86 or something like that.
And that's a good film.
That is a wonderful film. It's been a long time since
Sigourney Weaver, and
mid-80s.
Mid-80s, yeah.
Mid-80s.
Wonderful film.
Extraordinary piece of filmmaking.
Yeah. I'm going to do 3, but really fast. 2 recommendations, an anti-recommendation. This is how long it's been since we've filmed. Is Gene Hackman died right after, I think, the last time we shot. So that next week, I sat down with my eldest and we watched French Connection, which is even better than I remembered. I don't know. There's a lot of great Gene Hackman films. French Connection is great. It just, what I didn't remember is it's a lot of just like walking around New York, right? In that sense, there's not a lot of dialogue. There's not a lot of acting because it's following people as, Popeye Doyle, the cop, is following people mostly on foot. And there is one great car chase, and with the train, that's there is a great chase scene in it, but real solid. Also, a couple weeks ago, we watched this film Wildcat, which was directed by Ethan Hawke, and it stars his daughter Maya as Flannery O'Connor. And it is a kind of biopic of Flannery O'Connor. And it helps if you know O'Connor's stories and a little bit about her background. Like read the Wikipedia page; it'll probably give you enough. And it helps if you've read some of her stories a little bit. But I think even if you're not a big Flannery O'Connor fan, it's a very powerful film about an author and her illness and her faith, and then how this all works out. This becomes the source of her art.
What was the title again?
It's called Wildcat. Wildcat, yeah. Ethan Hawke, and then Maya Hawke.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got a woman who plays her mother, who's a big time actress, and I've just lost it. Who it is? When you see it, you'll know it. Anti-recommendation. This past Tuesday, I did go to Thunderbolts. It is 2 hours of my life. I'm never getting back. That's the Marvel movie. It's a Marvel movie. And
they've been falling apart for years, though.
I saw a trailer for it a couple months ago, and I went to a different film, and I thought, this might be stupid, but very funny. Like might be like very tongue-in-cheek and just kind of ridiculous. Sort of like Guardians of the Galaxy.
Or like the Avengers. The first Avengers had a lot of great comedy.
Yeah, just in almost like self-knowledge that we know, because it seems to be, in fact, this is true like the first 20% of the film. We know we're B-list actors. We're B-list Marvel heroes and kind of a B Marvel. That could be the joke. Right. The problem is about a third of the way through, it starts to take itself seriously. And that was a big mistake. And it ends up with a kind of like a moralistic story that is the biggest budget ABC afternoon special. That level of narrative that you've ever seen. It was like a very special episode of Blossom, but with a $250 million budget and a lot of explosions.
Has anybody seen Snow Falling on Cedars?
No.
No, I haven't.
I think that's Ethan Hawke.
It is. I know it is, but I've not seen it.
It is a brilliant movie. Now, it will break your heart. I mean, if you're a crier, you will cry at the end of this movie. Okay. I will say though, I mean, it's just Carolyn and I've seen it twice now. Carolyn and I watched it, and it brought her to tears, which doesn't often happen.
We just watched him in White Fang with the kids. I think it's a Disney film, but
it's hard.
But well done. It's a fairly decent representation of the
I can't get past
Jack London story.
Ethan Hawke, though, because I remember that movie Sunshine, in which I hated so much, where he was just wandering around Vienna meeting this woman.
That
was so awful.
Because there's three of those.
Oh, there's three of them. Okay,
there's like before sunrise, after sunrise.
Well,
after
bad
sunset,
bad love stories.
After tea, right?
But Snow Falling on Cedars is based on a novel, which I haven't read, but I read other stuff by the author. He's pretty good. But it's a young man. It's set just before and during and just after the Second World War, and he's living in the Northwest somewhere. His dad's a newspaperman, which he eventually takes over the newspaper. But he falls in love fairly young with this Japanese girl who's living next door. And then it involves a mystery that has to be solved to save somebody from possibly being executed for a crime he didn't commit. That's sort of the whole thing. I really...
Right, Snow Falling on Cedars.
Snow Falling on Cedars.
Have you guys seen Nosferatu?
No, we keep talking about it.
We'll talk about it next time.
Yeah, it's next fall when we meet again. We'll talk about Nosferatu. And
Maybe we'll watch it. Yeah.
What's this? The vampire movie that's like in New Orleans or something. And it's just out. Like, is it Sinners? Is that the name of it?
I know. Yeah, I get vaguely familiar with this, but it's supposed to be good.
I think it's in Louisiana, and it's kind of a weird vampire flick. So.
Weird vampire film.
Yeah. Anyhow, well, that gives you lots of movie recommendations. So we hope you enjoyed the show. We're filming this the day before commencement at Northern State University. This will be our last show for the year. So it'll be next fall when we'll see you again for Spotlight at Northern.
Have a safe summer.
Yeah.